Modernism was an international cultural movement which affected literature and arts in the first decades of the 20th century. Modernists were against tradition and Western values in general. They rejected the heritage of classical literature and interrupted that kind of father to son transmission of classical knowledge, literature, arts, and science. What is left is alienation, fragmentation, disintegration of all values. Some kind of wasteland remains, a heap of broken images, just to quote T.S. Eliot's masterpiece. According to modernism, artists must break with tradition, particularly with religious and political views of the past. Everything in the world is as we perceive it. We create reality. It's up to us to create reality by our perception of it. And all truths are relative. There is no absolute truth. And even history becomes a negative thing. Only the present is important. We need to remember that modernism comes from Latin modus hodiernus, that is the way we do things today, here and now. Modernist artists and writers brought down the limitations of space and time. Any interpretation of reality is possible since the perception of reality is relative, temporary, and subject to change. The past is something that can be reshaped, we may say translated into new forms, into original modern forms. And modern poetry began with imagism, which was invented by the American poet Ezra Pound. Imagists used clear and precise images which the poet represents and shows, often in very short but really effective poems. According to the haiku poems written in Chinese and Japanese, by the way, Pound was fascinated by these kind of languages, this kind of pictographic languages, which replace words and concepts, that is, abstract things, with concrete pictograms. The most famous example of such a short poem is In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound, which is a two-line poem with only objects on the front. We have the faces, we have the petals on the bow, and no verbs, no action, just a still picture, which can be placed anywhere and at any time. T.S. Eliot will theorize the objective correlative based on this principle. But what is imagism? It was first collected, this word was first collected in an anthology called Des Imagistes, a Frenchified name. It's from 1914, and it was published in London and New York. Ezra Pound was the real theorist of imagism. What are his rules for writing an imagist poem? You need to follow and obtain a direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective, a sensation, a thought, or objective. And second, you need to use absolutely no extra word that does not contribute to the representation. First of all, we need to focus on the thing. A poem is imagined as an image of a thing. There's some kind of empiricism, some kind of scientific language, and maybe that's why they are so short. You will hear Pound talking about poetry as similar to science, as they both aim at objectivity. The thing may be subjective or objective. It may be a real thing outside the poet, or an emotion, a thought, something inside the poet. And Pound wanted to make the word a thing, to make the word an image, and the image a thing. This is what he said in A Few Don'ts by an Imagist. So then Pound moves on from imagism to vorticism. What's a vortex? A vortex is the point of maximum energy. Think of a storm. It represents in mechanics the point of greatest efficiency. We use the words greatest efficiency in the precise sense, Pound says, as it would be used in a textbook of physics, of mechanics. And think about man. You may think of man as a toy of circumstances, or you may think of man as directing a force against the circumstance. Man as a being conceiving, creating, reacting, instead of observing, reflecting. And what is poetry? Poetry is the primary pigment, the primary element of vorticism, and the central point, the vortex of poetry, is the image. So it does not come as a surprise if T.S. Eliot will theorize the objective correlative. That is, you need to represent and show a set of objects which evoke immediately an emotion, and only that. Actually, even vorticism will be replaced by a new concept, the ideogram. And that's why Pound became so interested in Chinese and Japanese languages, because the ideograms of these languages were perfect for a poet who wanted to imagine the poem as an image of a thing. And even the very word in Chinese and Japanese is an image of a thing. And this becomes an ideal, an aesthetic ideal for Ezra Pound, who wanted language to give us some kind of immediate access to the things really existing outside the word. So we don't even need a poet, the poet, as a medium. The reader needs to be immediately in contact, in touch with these external things. Think of In a Station of the Metro. It is the shortest famous poem in modern poetry. It's just a 2-line poem. It says, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." So Pound is walking through the streets, think of London or Paris, and he sees crowds of people coming out of the subway. They seem to him like figures that come from the world of the dead, some kind of Hades, as if the inhabitants of Hades were coming out up to this world, to the world of the living, to occupy our world. And probably this is because even in Assyrian Babylonian mythology, they used to have this idea of dead people coming back to the world of the living to occupy it. Now, let's move back to In a Station of the Metro. The title itself functions as a locator. It tells us where we are. We are in the Paris underground, in a station of the metro. What is being observed, and what kind of metaphor is it generating? Is Pound really observing faces and comparing them to petals on a wet black bough? Is he seeing both these things, faces and petals, we have two elements, faces and petals, joined and compressed, faces and petals. It's wrong to speak of a metaphor or a simile. We should use the word that Pound used, ideogram, borrowing this idea from Chinese and Japanese writing, that is, the haiku poems, which were themselves very short. And what else? In this two-line poem, Pound uses parataxis, not hypotaxis. We have a series of things, faces, petals. We don't even have a conjunction. We don't even have an end between faces and petals. The syntax itself is compressed, creating a new kind of perception, a perception that is modern itself. It's urban, the perception of the crowd of urban cities, of modern cities. And it's also timeless. There's no need to know what time it is, where we are. Okay, we are in Paris, but it could be actually anywhere and at any time. The time is now. The time is present, the present. These faces, here and now. This is an image, a picture of modernity itself. It's the picture of an underground that is compared to the classical underworld, the Hades, the reign of the realm of dead people, the Hades. It's the same as the one we find in Homer, in Virgil, in Dante, in John Milton. Pound, let me just read the story of the poem's composition. Pound says, 3 years ago in Paris, I got out of a metro train at La Concorde, and I saw suddenly a beautiful face, and then another, and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful woman. And I tried all that day to find words for what this had meant to me. And I could not find any words that seemed to me worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. And that evening, I was still trying, and I found suddenly the expression. I do not mean that I found words, but there came an equation. See, I told you, it's like science, like maths. One image poem. So what we will find in Ungaretti, Montale, Quasimodo was born here in a station of the metro, of the Paris metro. And so Pound says, I wrote a 30-line poem and I destroyed it. 6 months later, I made a poem half that length, so shorter and shorter. A year later, I made the following haiku-like sentence. So he cut the poem from a 30-line poem to a 15-line poem to a 2-line poem. So compression, cutting things down and eliminating words. The truth itself is something you reach only by cutting away any rhetorical ornament. So Pound takes Japanese and Chinese poetries as models for this, we may say, aesthetics of compression.